Hello and welcome to Politics Theory Other. My name is Alex Doherty and my guest today is Hamza Hamouchene. Although it's increasingly common to describe the Palestinian struggle for liberation in terms of a conflict with settler colonialism, it's more rare for Palestine to be situated in the broader context of anti-imperialist struggles of the 19th and 20th centuries, and specifically the wars for liberation conducted by the FLN in Algeria and the Vietminh and the National Liberation Front in Vietnam. My guest today, Hamza Hamouchene, seeks to do just that. In our conversation, we talked about the importance, when thinking about the Palestinian situation today, of recognizing that although the success of past decolonisation struggles is seen now as inevitable, they were not so perceived at the time, and that in the cases of both Algeria and Vietnam, their battles for independence endured for an extremely long time and were punctuated by what seemed to be possibly permanent defeats. We also talked about the Vietminh's victory over the French at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, and the shockwaves this sent through territories under the control of the French and other European empires elsewhere. We went on to talk about the direct assistance the Vietnamese and Algerians provided to each other, and how they both aided the Palestinians after they had achieved independence. Finally, we talked about the relevance of the moment of the high point of anti-colonial struggle to the Palestinian cause now, given the even more challenging geopolitical situation that Palestinian resistance faces today. If you find this interview useful, then please do consider becoming a £5 patron of the podcast. The show depends entirely upon listener support, and as well as keeping PTO going, you'll also get access to bonus content. You can support the show in pounds or whatever your local currency happens to be, and you can pledge any amount you choose. Go to patreon.com/poltheoryother to sign up. Hamza Hamouchene is a London-based Algerian researcher, activist, and commentator, and a founding member of the Algeria Solidarity Campaign, Environmental Justice North Africa, and the North African Food Sovereignty Network. He is currently the Arab Region Programme Coordinator at the Transnational Institute. He's the author or editor of 5 books, most recently Towards Palestinian Liberation, Global Perspectives on Anti-Colonial Resistance and Solidarity, which Hamza edited with Abi Bey, and which includes Hamza's chapter titled Vietnam, Algeria, Palestine, Passing on the Torch of Anti-Colonial Struggle. So Hamza, in the introduction to the book, you emphasize the importance of situating the Palestinian struggle for liberation in the longue durée as part of the broader history of the struggle to end classical imperialism that reaches back to the 19th century and even the late 18th century, in fact, in the case of the Haitian Revolution. And this leads you, in your chapter of the book, to focus on the examples of Algeria and Vietnam, and the relationship between liberation struggles in those two countries and with the Palestinians, as well as the lessons that can be learned from those two earlier examples of anti-colonial conflict and what can usefully be applied to the current situation in historic Palestine. And part of the utility of situating the Palestine struggle in that longer history seems to be, if I'm reading you correctly, that the cases of Vietnam and perhaps particularly Algeria show how wars of liberation can be extremely protracted, drawn-out affairs that are often punctuated by devastating and seemingly, at the time, irrevocable defeats. And it seems to me that is something that is easy to lose sight of in the case of Algeria and Vietnam, because we perhaps tend to focus on the later moments of those struggles. We think of the FLN's campaign in Algeria of the mid-1950s and the early 1960s, which of course resulted in France's defeat. Or we think of the late phases of the Vietnam War of the late 1960s, 1970s, rather than about the prior period of anti-imperial struggle against the French presence in Vietnam and the rest of what was then known, of course, as Indochina. So if we perhaps start with the Algeria War, could you say a bit about just the sheer duration of the French colonial presence in Algeria and something about the different phases of the imperial project in the country?
First of all, thanks, Alex, for inviting me to share some reflections and thoughts and to tell your audience a little bit about the new edited book titled Towards Palestinian Liberation, global perspective on anti-colonial resistance and solidarity. And you're absolutely right. In the book, we try to resituate Palestine in that long history of anti-colonial struggles that go back to the Haitian Revolution at the end of the 18th century and earlier 19th century. But also we wanted to emphasize, as you mentioned, the need to see struggles from a longue durée perspective. Why? Because the moment you reduce dynamics or events to a single thing that is taking place within a specific time or a given place, you will have a skewed picture and a distorted assessment. So instead, we need to see all dynamics and events, however horrible they are, including the genocide in Gaza today, as a kind of an accumulation of experiences, lessons, and contradictions that may culminate in the end of systems of oppression when the right conditions come together at the national, regional, and international level. So we really wanted to put that at the heart of our analysis and say, look, if you look back at history and at other struggles from Algeria to Vietnam, Cuba, South Africa, and other parts of the world, you see that these struggles were not really linear. Some of them took more than a century till they vanquished or expelled the colonial powers. The same analysis that I wanted to convey in the chapter that I've written, drawing the parallels between the Algerian, Vietnamese, and Palestinian struggles. So if we start just talking about the Algerian struggles, for example, French colonialism stayed in Algeria 132 years. When France invaded Algeria in 1830, their army spent the first 5 decades quelling an insurgency, rebellions, uprisings in every part of the country. What that meant, displacements, meant massacres, meant expropriations, meant the infamous enfumade, putting whole tribes in caves and asphyxiating them. It also involved the expropriation of the basic mean for production, which is the land. Those confiscatory measures that took place in the first 5 to 6 decades of French colonialism shattered the heart of the agrarian subsistence agriculture and subsistence economy. Just in the 1860s, estimate that 500,000 rural people died because of those confiscatory measures, because of famine, because of droughts, and because they feared for their lives. So the rural population tried to always resist, to organize and uprise against those unjust measures. It took around 4 to 5 decades till the 1920s for a modern form of Algerian nationalism to surface in order to fight French colonialism with other means through political agitation, participation in elections. But I think what is unique with French settler colonialism in Algeria is that the country was administered for the first time, that was in 1881, as part of French territory.
Yes, a French department, as it were. Yeah.
French department, exactly. So the French considered Algeria as their possession, but it's part of their territory, not just like as an overseas territory.
And what you described there, the initial period of counterinsurgency and a crushing of local resistance, if one were to, as you say, sort of take a snapshot of Algeria at that time, you could perhaps take a very pessimistic impression and think, French colonialism can never be defeated here. The level of resistance is far too weak to achieve a victory. And as you say, it's necessary to take that longue durée perspective. And perhaps in the same way, it seems in some ways the wrong way to put it, given the degree of violence, but it helps to put into perspective the current situation in Palestine, that indeed things are horrendous and there is great cause for sorrow and pessimism, but it doesn't follow that the Palestinian cause is in a moment of irrevocable defeat, right?
Exactly. The example that comes to my mind right now is in 1930. That was exactly 100 years of French colonialism in Algeria. The French colonialists celebrated the centenary of their presence in a pompous way, extremely arrogant, extremely confident that Algeria is theirs and they're gonna stay there for a very, very long time, if not for eternity. And at the same time, also the Algerians themselves, even that was the beginning of some Algerian nationalist movements, there was, a huge, how can I say, disappointment within the Algerian population that France is going to stay there. But imagine 3 decades later, the French were expelled. So that's why it's really important to take a long durée perspective when analyzing struggles, when looking at things. Things are not deterministics. You may face a crushing defeat at some point, but then you'll have victory in another. And things accumulate, and the people and the movements learn from the mistakes of the past and they try to organize differently. And also we need to be aware that the struggles do not happen in a vacuum. They do not happen simply at the national level. They are in a dialectical relation and dialogue with the dynamics happening regionally and internationally. So that's why the Algerian struggle or the Vietnamese struggle cannot be seen in isolation from the wave of decolonization that took place in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, the rise of third worldism and the non-aligned movement. So those conditions helped those anti-colonial struggles and empowered them to go till the end.
Yes, well, that very much brings me on to my next question. So, as you write about in the chapter, a major inspiration for the Algerians and the FLN was the Vietminh's extraordinary victory over the French at Dien Bien Phu in northwestern Vietnam in 1954, which precipitated France's withdrawal from Indochina. Can you say something on how significant and inspiring that victory was for anti-colonial forces in Algeria and other territories that were living under European colonial rule at that time?
Yeah, sure. I think 70 years ago, that battle took place, and you mentioned the date, exactly on the 7th of May, 1954, in North Vietnam, in the valley of Tonkin, where the armies of Ho Chi Minh defeated a conventional army in a conventional war. It's really hard to overstate the impact of such a humiliating defeat on the French, on the psyche of the colonized and the oppressed all over the world, especially within the French Empire and within the French colonies, from Algeria to Senegal and from Madagascar to Morocco. If we look, for example, just to Algeria at the time in 1954, the Algerian FLN leaders, or let's say nationalist leaders in 1954, they were no under illusion that they can defeat the French easily or in a conventional war. But their confidence was bolstered when they heard the news that the Vietnamese defeated the French in Dien Bien Phu. And, Frantz Fanon at the time, he said exactly these words. He said, the victory of the people of Vietnam in Dien Bien Phu is not strictly just a Vietnamese victory. And since then, all colonized people, especially within the French Empire, were seeking how they can replicate another Dien Bien Phu, how they can manage it, how they can bring the conditions to make it happen. For the Algerians, for Frantz Fanon, and for others, what they saw with the Vietnamese victory is that colonized people are capable of generating the revolutionary violence to impose decolonization on the colonizers. So, for example, there were two leaders that I quoted in my chapter. I mean, Algerian FNL leaders. One of them is Youssef Ben Khadda, and the other one is Farhat Abbas, that were, describing Dien Bien Phu in epochal change in terms. So for Ben Khadda, for example, he said that was a powerful catalyst that pushed us to consider armed struggle as the first priority. Farhat Abbas described it as the Valmy of the people in reference to the battle where the French Revolutionary Army defeated the Prussians in 1792. And others described it as the Stalingrad of decolonization. Really, that battle is a turning point in the discussion around decolonization. So it was not just a matter between the French and Vietnamese, but it reverberated all over the world. And it was a signal that other battles are coming. And in fact, the Algerian Revolution started 6 months later, in November 1954.
Just hearing you talk there, a later example that comes to mind that has a similar dynamic and a similar resonance, maybe not to quite the same scale, but is the Battle of Quito Carnavale in Angola during the apartheid era and the significance of seeing the South African forces defeated. Of course, a little bit like Dien Bien Phu, this is a conventional battle. It's not a guerrilla struggle, but it still has that consequence of making Black South Africans feel that they can defeat the white South African forces. I mean, as you say there, you describe how the Algerians took inspiration, but it wasn't uncomplicated, unsophisticated attempt to directly recreate Dien Bien Phu, because that, as you say, it was a set piece battle. It was more like an encounter between two conventional armies than a guerrilla struggle. And it depended very considerably on Chinese assistance, something that wasn't so relevant to the context of North Africa. Is that broadly correct, that the inspiration wasn't a sort of direct one-to-one?
Just before I answer this, Alex, in terms of the inspiration of such, victories by colonized against colonizer, it shatters the myth of the invincibility of the colonizer or the bigger power. And I think it's the same thing today in Palestine. We cannot really underestimate the psychological impact of such victories. But if we come back to Algeria and the comparison with Vietnam and the question of Dien Bien Phu, I read this wonderful book by Christopher Gosha called The Road to Dien Bien Phu. And in the book, he argues that Ho Chi Minh ended up administering two kinds of wartime states. The first one is the guerrilla type, where you can hold out against the colonizer. And I guess this has been replicated in various parts of the world, including by the Algerian FLN in North Africa and including by others. The other type was the type that could go and mobilize, or let's say generate, the required military and organizational capacity and forces that could defeat a conventional army in a set piece battle. And actually, that's what the Vietnamese managed to do, similar to what have the Chinese communists have done before them. And the relations between the Chinese and the Vietnamese is important here because the Vietnamese benefited from Chinese assistance, Chinese advisors, but also they introduced instruction in modern military science. They introduced the draft laws, the mobilization laws, and all of this helped them to shape a revolutionary experience that has not been seen in any part of the world in the 20th century when it comes to decolonization struggles. It's not just the Algerians who did not manage to replicate the conventional army of the Vietnamese or Dien Bien Phu,
No,
but
no.
others as well. So it's really important to make that distinctions, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that if you cannot mobilize the same powers and capacities as the Vietminh have done, that you cannot defeat colonial powers. And the Algerians proved that in terms of using the guerrilla, but within a political vision, within an umbrella of other political tactics, political agitation, diplomacy, that would converge together to exercise more pressure and defeat the enemy politically rather than militarily. Because, let's say, the Algerians did not defeat the French militarily per se. They created manageable conditions for the French, but at the end, they won diplomatically and politically at the international scene.
One of the parallels that you draw between Algeria, Vietnam, and Palestine is that these are all cases of settler colonialism. But I suppose one objection I imagine some people might make would be to say, well, how comparable are those examples really, given that the settler presence in Vietnam, for example, was very small. I think something like 0.5% of the population at its height. And France there ran its colonies more on the sort of the model of the British in India rather than in a sort of a case of true mass settler colonialism. And while Algeria might seem to be a much more relevant situation to the one in Palestine, even in that case, the settler population was never more than a very significant minority, with the non-Muslim population not more than 15% of the population. And something similar could, of course, be said about South Africa and Zimbabwe too, of course. How useful are those comparisons, in your opinion, given the very different demographic situation in Palestine today? Does the sheer size of Israel's Jewish population make for a very different strategic situation?
This is a very good question, but it's also a challenging one. My point of trying to draw the parallels between the different experiences and struggles is not to say that these struggles are exactly the same, or
Yes, yeah.
or to ignore, the differences, the specificities in each one of them, but is to say, look, there are lessons that can be learned from each struggle, and to say also that Palestinians learned from their Algerian brothers and sisters, as they have learned also from the Vietnamese. And to say also that the Vietnamese and Algerians saw themselves in the Palestinian struggle. They saw that the Palestinian struggle is the mirror of their own struggles. And many of those revolutionaries have said those things. But in terms of the settler colonial experience, of course, there are huge demographic differences between the three cases. I would say that maybe Algeria is much closer to Palestine than to Vietnam. And in terms of the size of the settler colonial population. But I think what matters at the end of the day, at least to me, is that all these three people faced a settler colonial system. A settler colonial system that is built on the elimination of the native, built on massacres and genocide, built on the erasure and the replacement of the natives, their culture, their languages, even ecologies and environments by alien things that usually are European, that goes within that European civilizing mission. And the Israelis have been doing the same as well since 1948, basically copying what British European colonialism have done in their colonies. But also to say that settler colonialism operates with similar dynamics in terms of expansion, in terms of expropriation of the native, and in terms of dehumanization as well. Because in the three cases, the dehumanization, I would say, has reached unparalleled levels,
Mm.
calling people, rats, animals, barbarians, and savages, just in order to justify the cruel violence against them. And in the three cases, whenever the natives try to rebel or to demand, even peacefully, their rights to self-determination, or demand anything, that has been quashed with brutal, 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 brutal violence. Of course, there are differences between the three cases, but I think the parallels are really big.
On that point you make about the way in which resistance is portrayed as barbarism and so on, one thing that the chapter draws out is that while the justice of the Algerian cause seems to the vast majority of us very obvious today, right? It was certainly not so perceived in that straightforward way at the time, right? In France and other European societies. And resistance in general and Algerian violence against French settlers in particular was portrayed in ways that are highly reminiscent of reactions to October 7th as evidence of the supposed barbarism of the indigenous population. But today, nobody really, no one serious tries to sort of both sides the Algerian war, even though there was indeed violence on both sides, right?
When I was writing that chapter, and I was looking at the history of the Algerian struggle and the history of the Vietnamese struggle. And of course, I was writing in the period of the genocide, in the first year when the genocidal war was raging in Gaza. That was in 2024. The parallels were so strong to ignore. The same colonial genocidal mindset and the same racist and orientalist and essentialist explanations of why the oppressed or the colonized people revolt have been put on the table talking about the Palestinians. It's like 7th of October or all other forms of Palestinian resistance are put down as this pure evil, irrational savagery, timeless barbarism of these medieval terrorists who are just bloodthirsty. And this just ignores the whole political context of a century of colonialism, settler colonialism, apartheid, and occupation. The same thing happened in Algeria. The same thing happened in Vietnam. The level of dehumanization has been so advanced, and hate was cast through racial terms. The Algerians and Vietnamese were described as criminals, as bandits, as terrorists, these, bloodthirsty thugs. Why do they hate us so much? And the same thing is being done to Palestinians today. If you remember, just in the first few weeks of the genocide, many Israeli politicians were describing Palestinians as rats, as animals, as terrorists, justifying all forms of violence against all of them. And we can bring in many, many examples here, from the Algerian War to other episodes in 1945, the bombing done by the Americans against the Vietnamese. It's always when the oppressed and the colonized dare to rebel, this is never accepted and is crushed with disproportionate level of violence. That's what we've seen in all these cases before, and that's what we are seeing in Palestine today.
Just on the way in which attitudes towards the Algeria War or the Vietnam War, say, have changed over time. I mean, another thing that is interesting and telling about that, I think, is the way that the Algeria War, say, was perceived very differently even within the French left, right? Even amongst socialists. So the French left was internally divided. You had figures like Albert Camus, a major figure of the French left, himself born in Algeria to I think, a relatively poor Pied Noir family, and certainly someone who was a critic of the injustice of French rule, but also he nonetheless argued that the Algerian uprising was part of a Soviet plot to undermine Western Europe, and he argued in favor of autonomy rather than full independence. And then there's the case of the French Communist Party in 1956 voting in favor of a special powers bill intended to break the insurgency. And again, those positions seem really quite bizarre to us today. And I mean, there's that slogan, of course, everyone will have been against this, that people use regarding Gaza, right? It's easy to imagine something very similar at a later point in time, or at least we would hope so.
This is a wonderful observation, Ali, honestly, which demonstrates again that when you go back to history and check those struggles, you will find similar stories, similar explanations, similar arguments to what we are seeing today. Not everyone was with the Algerian Revolution at the time, including the Marxists in France, including, what is called the left. The same thing again with the apartheid in South Africa. Not everyone was with Mandela. He was called the terrorist. Not everyone was with the South African struggle for their freedom. And the same thing in Vietnam. So I think it's really important to put things into their context and understand what happened. But I think one important observation that I want to make here that link the different struggles that we're talking about today, the Vietnamese, the Algerian, and Palestinians, is the role that the settlers played in those experiences. Usually, more than often, most of the time, if not all the time, they were with the colonial elites. They were with their armies. Of course, there are exceptions, but they are the extreme minority. But the majority of the settler population were upholding the colonial system. The settler colonials in Algeria did not want France to leave. They did everything till the end, including the use of terrorism, what we call the l'organisation secrète, l'OAS, that tried really to create a climate of chaos and violence and terrorism in Algeria.
As far as attempting a coup, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, they weren't messing around.
Yeah, they really wanted to stay. And the same thing has been seen in Vietnam. When the French came back in 1945 after the defeat of Nazism, the French wanted to reestablish their empire whatever the cost. Yeah. And you were mentioning the left. It was left or right, religious or secular, it didn't matter. They needed to uphold their empire. And they've done that in Vietnam, they've done that in Algeria. And the Israelis, the Zionists, are trying to do exactly the same. You look just at the poll and you see how the Israeli population, majority of it, were in favor of the genocide, were in favor of the war in Lebanon, were in favor of the war in Iran. So, yeah, I think these are the similarity that we need to grapple with to understand how we defeat those forces.
Regarding the relationship between resistance movements in Algeria and Vietnam, one of the really fascinating things you describe in the chapter is the presence of tens of thousands of North African soldiers in Vietnam as part of the French military, and how many of them went on to desert and join the Vietminh in their war against the French. Can you say something on that aspect of the French war in Vietnam, which I think is perhaps not that well known to most people?
Actually, tens of thousands of Algerians, Moroccans, North Africans, Senegalese have been drafted and sent to fight the French war against the Vietnamese in what is called the First Indochina War. And those Algerians and Moroccans themselves, some of them have went to desert the French army to join the Viet Minh in their war against the French. But at the same time, what the Vietnamese have been trying to do is reach out to revolutionaries in North Africa. They reached out, for example, to Abdelkrim al-Khattabi. This is a famous Moroccan leader who led, a war against the Spanish colonialism in northern Morocco. He defeated them, the Spanish, actually, in a famous battle called the Anwel Battle in 1921, and established a short-lived republic from 21 till 2026. He was in exile in Cairo at the time when he received a letter from one minister of the Ho Chi Minh government saying that we need your support to convince the North Africans soldiers to not join the efforts of the French and to desert the army. But also he called on him to ask the dockers in North Africa to not load any war material going to Indochina at the time. And actually, there are letters documented between the Vietnamese minister and also Abdelkrim al-Khattabi, powerful words in terms of drawing the interconnectedness of the struggle. Abdelkrim Khattabi, if I remember his words correctly, he said, the victory of colonialism, even if it is at the other end of the world, is our defeat, and it is a defeat of our cause. And people saw really, really the parallels. And actually, this has been a very important thing that I wanted to highlight, which is the solidarity, the transnational solidarity between oppressed and colonized people that played the driving force in changing history at the time. The Vietnamese were not fighting on their own, the Algerians were not fighting on their own. Colonized people were looking out, checking what is happening around them, connecting the dots, helping each other. So, for example, the dockers in the ports of Algiers and Oran have taken actions and refused to load material that was destined to go to Vietnam at the time. These echoes some of the things that we've been seeing in the last 2 years here as well in the world regarding the solidarity with Palestine.
In that section on the presence of North African soldiers in Vietnam, so you go on to talk about the really sort of extraordinary career of Mohammed Ben Omar Larak, the Moroccan trade unionist and communist who traveled to Hanoi in the 1940s. Can you talk about his role in Vietnam, what he was doing there?
No, when I heard about that story from actually from some Moroccan comrades of mine, I was fascinated. And actually, there is some research who has been conducted on his heroic work in Vietnam. I read two books about his biography and the things he has done and the connections that he has drawn between the different struggles in North Africa and Indochina. So he has an alias called Maruf. People also call him Maruf. But he was also given a Vietnamese name by Ho Chi Minh himself. His name is An Ma, which means, I think, brother horse in Vietnamese. He has been, a well decorated man. He has been given a title of a general. And he has done an incredible work in terms of psychological warfare and anti colonial propaganda in Vietnam. So his task was, first of all, to convince the North Africans in the other side to desert. That's one main role of his, but also to politically educate those deserters, but also the captured soldiers, because not everyone deserted. There were tens of thousands of soldiers who went to Vietnam. I would say maybe hundreds have deserted, but many have been captured. And Maruf was tasked in terms of politically educating them, in terms of nationalism, even Marxism, because he belonged to the Moroccan Communist Party. He was a trade unionist himself, and convincing them to go back to their own countries to fight French colonialism. And actually, the impact of that role that he played was so huge. Many Algerians, the Algerians who went back around that time, 1954, 1955, they participated in the Algerian War that started in 1954. They've become the cadres of the FLN. Same thing for the Moroccans who went back. So he played a really important role, which again shows the interconnectedness of the struggle, the transnational solidarity between different people that are really not placed geographically next to each other. Morocco is one side and Vietnam is in the other. But these people, these revolutionaries, understood that they were fighting one system, that colonial system that was trying to hold the imperial line in Vietnam. And actually, some of their commanders and generals, I mean the French, were saying exactly that at the time. They are saying, we are fighting here in Vietnam to defend our positions in Africa. Also, all these revolutionaries, the North Africans, the Vietnamese, understood that if you give a blow, if you defeat colonialism in one part of the world, you will defeat it in the other, and you will help revolutions in other parts. And I think the similarity also can be brought to today, where US-led imperialism is trying to hold the imperial line in Palestine and the wider Middle East. They are defending their global hegemony and dominations in there, and they are fighting fiercely to maintain it.
Yes, I suppose another contemporary example is also the war with Iran. It's almost as if we can sort of feel the ground shifting under our feet in the way that other regional powers in the Gulf are sort of seeing that the United States is not a guarantor of their rule in the way that they once were, and they're sort of increasingly hedging their bets and looking to other powers. One can imagine that Iran being sort of potentially a first domino in a sort of broader collapse of US control, although obviously there would be nothing necessarily sort of linear about that. When it comes to the counterinsurgency tactics that the French adopted in Algeria and that the French and the Americans used in Vietnam, there are some obvious parallels with the way that Israel has prosecuted its war against the Palestinians, including making access to food a weapon of war. Could you say something about those sorts of commonalities that you describe in the chapter?
When people look at what has been happening in Gaza, at least in the first few weeks and first few months, people couldn't believe the level of violence, cruelty, and barbarism coming from a colonial power. In that chapter, I wanted to draw the attention of people that this is not just unique to Israel. Maybe Israel is doing it for the first time as a televised genocide, but similar cruelty and monstrosities happened before in other parts of the world, and specifically in Vietnam and Algeria. Let me just give like a few examples to the listeners so they can understand and grasp the level of violence that has been used in the so-called counterinsurgency and crushing uprisings and revolutions. So the Algerian Revolution started in 1954, ended up in 1962. So 8 years of bloody horrors that took place there. 1.5 million perished in that war. A quarter of the population at the time was interned in prison camps, in kind of camps. A half of the rural population, which was around 3 million, was displaced. 8,000 villages were burned and raised by bombs and napalms. Hundreds of thousands of agrarian land was burned and destroyed. So you can imagine the level of famine at the time. So the torture that has been used was at a huge scale in terms of trying to extract information and also dismantle the FLN networks in various parts of the country. This is like a cursory overview of what happened just in 8 years. But if we go back 10 years before, in May 1945, the massacres that ensued was a traumatic moment for all Algerians living at the time. So 8th of May 1945, we had the defeat of Nazism. We have the celebration of victory of Europe Day, where millions of Europeans were celebrating the end of the Second World War and the defeat of Nazism. Algerians fought alongside the French to defeat the Nazis. And they thought that it's their turn to get their independence and freedom. So on 8th of May, they marched in a town called Sétif in Algeria. They marched asking for a free and independent Algeria. For the first time, they raised the Algerian flag, the flag that will go to become the FLN's flag. There was a big repression by the French, and a rebellion took place that led to the massacre and killing of 103 European settlers. The retaliation was monstrous and disproportionate. For 2 months, the Algerian army, air, navy, troops bombed whole regions, razed and burned hundreds of villages to the ground. And with the settlers, with vengeful settlers, the troops killed tens of thousands of civilians. All of them are civilians. There was no army at the time. All of them were civilians in 2 months. The estimates go up to 45,000 people in 2 months. Just imagine the disproportionate retaliation and the barbarism killing all these populations. The similarities are really hard to ignore when we talk about the 7th of October. For me, it's the same. People dared, to ask for their rights, either in peaceful or armed struggle. That is not disallowed, and the retaliation is much more brutal and much more disproportionate. The other tactics that has been used in both Vietnam and Algeria, but also in Palestine, we've seen it, is food as a weapon of war. The French were the first to use that in a 20th century decolonization struggle. And they said, you need to starve the adversary, you need to starve whole populations. They were not starving the military or the Vietminh, they were starving civilian populations. And there is this quote by one of their generals. He said that if we destroyed the whole water buffaloes, if we destroyed the whole access of the Vietnamese to rice, we would have them at our mercy as we wish. And that's what you've seen also in Gaza. The first few weeks, officials from the Israeli government saying we need to cut energy, we need to cut food, we need to cut water for everyone. So you have them at your mercy and you massacre them at will.
On that point about using food as a weapon of war, the other example that springs to mind is the use of herbicides by the Americans in Vietnam, which I think typically tends to get talked about in terms of its use against the NLF, the so-called Viet Cong, and the idea that Agent Orange was used to defoliate the jungle and deprive the guerrillas of cover. But the reality was that Agent Orange was one of a sort of a whole suite of products that were used, the so-called rainbow herbicides. And the strategy was indeed to destroy much of Vietnamese agriculture, again, in a similar way to what you're describing regarding Algeria and the use of starvation as a tactic in Gaza. You go on in the chapter to talk about how the Vietnamese, and especially the Algerians, in fact, went on to provide various forms of support for the Palestinians after the successful conclusions of their own liberation struggles. Could you talk about the kind of assistance that was provided, maybe particularly regarding the Algerian case, because it seemed to have been more substantial and more long-lasting, partly because of proximity, I suppose?
I said earlier that the two cases, Algeria and Palestine, are very close to each other. Actually, they consider themselves two sisters in the Arab world. Not only the Palestinians look up to their Algerian brothers and sisters and what they've done against the French, but also the Algerians see themselves in the Palestinians and their efforts to defeat Israeli colonialism. The intersections go back in history. So the French, sorry, the Palestinians were inspired by the Algerians' FLN and tactics of armed struggle, but also their efforts in terms of mobilizing different political groups in one banner. So that was an inspiration, a big inspiration to the Palestinians. The Algerians, at the same time, when they got their independence in 1962, they provided different types of support at many levels. So you had, diplomatic backing, you had military training and military assistance, you had also provisions of weapons and finances and so forth. I think 2 points in terms of Algeria's support. Algeria in the 60s and 70s was this mecca of revolutionaries from all over the world, from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, from Europe. It was a meeting point of all these movements that were fighting imperialism, colonialism, and white supremacy. That provided Palestinians a ground to meet in these revolutionary movements. They met the Tunisians, the Moroccans, the Guinean-Bissau, the Angolese, the Congolese, the South Africans, and also they met the Cuban Revolution in 1964 when Che Guevara traveled to Algiers at the time. They also traveled to China from Algeria in 1965. They met the Vietnamese in Algeria. So they built all these relations with different movements all over the world. And these weren't just minor networking or relations. These were relations that are important in the world making projects that the Palestinians were at the center of. A different project that challenges imperialism, colonialism, that was fighting for national sovereignty and a more egalitarian world. But the second point was the Algerians' involvement in Pan-Arabism and the efforts alongside Nasser of Egypt and other nationalists in the Arab region to defeat Zionism. So Algeria participated in the war of 1967, which is it was a defeat against the Israelis, but it also participated in 1973. It convinced
Often forgotten, right? Partly because they were particularly close and perhaps couldn't provide the level of direct military strength that was the case with, say, the Egyptians or the Syrians.
Exactly. And something that the Algerian president at the time, Boumediene, has done, which is truly honorable, is that he convinced the Soviet Union to provide weapons and tanks to the Syrian and Egyptian armies in 1967 because they were reluctant, the Soviet Union were reluctant at then. But he signed a check of $200 million, which is the value, I don't know, of more than $2 billion right now, saying, no, we cannot allow this. But then in terms of military training, many Palestinians have been trained in the Shershel Military Academy. The Algerians provided first support for the Palestinian Revolution that was launched in 1st of January 1965. They allowed Fatah to set up a military camp to train Palestinians from every part of the world. They provided them with weaponry, with finances, and Palestinians considered Algeria as a very important ally. And they declared, the independence of the Palestinian state in November 1988 in Algiers. And similar things can be said between the Algerian and Vietnamese. You had the famous Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish saying in 1973, when the war between Vietnam and the US was going into its last stages, saying, for the conscience of all people in the world, the Vietnamese gave us the torch, and it's up to us to continue the struggle. So the relations are really strong. Arafat traveled several times, in the 90s to Vietnam. And I think the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, was one of the only groups that was opposed to Chinese invasion of Vietnam.
So my last question then, Hamza, and this brings us up to the current context. So in the chapter, you certainly don't avoid the fact that the Palestinians are operating in a far more challenging international environment today. They're not riding a broader wave of decolonisation, even if we are seeing an increase in states of the so-called global south taking a more independent position than was the case at the height of US hegemony. And it's perhaps hard to imagine many of us feeling that history is on the side of the Palestinians in the way that perhaps seemed to be the case with the Algerians and the Vietnamese, given that, as I say, it's not in the same context of a global wave of decolonisation. And also perhaps because resistance groups today are not operating at a time when the sort of teleology of eventual and inevitable global communist victory over capitalism was still very widely believed. Could you say something on how challenging you think the current context is, and what gives you optimism in this seemingly very bleak moment?
Try to be hopeful, Alex, so we can end on on a hopeful note. I think this has been a wonderful conversation, and I think it's good to end on a hopeful note, but recognizing the challenges and difficulties. We cannot just be, romantic, foolish. So it's really important. So in terms of the change in times, and I think for us, retrospectively, it's easy to say, for the Algerians and Vietnamese, they had a more favorable international conditions. But if we go back and put ourselves in the shoes of the revolutionaries, they were facing huge challenges and extreme difficulties politically, militarily, socially, culturally, and diplomatically, facing multiple enemies at the same time. The Algerians and the Vietnamese were fighting one of the most sophisticated colonial powers in the world. It was the second colonial power of the time after, the British, but also it was the biggest fourth army in the world, and that was backed by NATO. So both Vietnamese and Algerians, they knew that the balance of powers and forces were not in their favor, at the military level, but they were fighting an overarching battle that combined different tactics and strategies, from armed struggle to political agitation to diplomatic efforts to connecting with other struggles either in the regions or in other parts of the world. And they were aware that you're gonna defeat colonialism and imperialism not just purely militarily. You need to wage that struggle for sure, but it needs to be within a broader political vision that combines different tools and tactics. So I think it's really important to say this. But it's true. The international conjuncture at the time was much more favorable. Both the Vietnamese and Algerian struggle were happening within this decolonization wave, the rise of the third worldism, the rise of the global south, new decolonized states trying to take their anti-colonial fervor into international spaces like the United Nations. So these helped for sure, especially the Algerians. The Algerians, they were really desperate. That's why they waged this armed struggle. They took the armed struggle to urban areas, the famous Battle of Algiers, but they ended up not winning it. But they won diplomatically because France at the time was isolated internationally. So they,
I suppose you could say something very similar about the Tet Offensive, right, during the Vietnam War. Not a straightforward military victory by any means. You could say it was a defeat, but it had the needed impact, particularly upon domestic US opinion, right, and showed that continuing the war was going to be something that would go on for a very long time and bleed the American army much more than it already had.
yeah. But if we come back now to the current context, yeah, it's qualitatively different. The United Nation of the 60s and 70s, many of the newly independent nations had hope in. They tried to build a new international economic order. They tried to push national sovereignty questions. They backed Palestine. They backed South African efforts against apartheid. But now the power of those spaces are waning. But I think what matters for us, and I really want to emphasize that point, is that transnational solidarity is really important and has played a driving force in making history. And I think we are seeing some glimpses of it now. We are seeing some move towards multipolarity, for sure, with the rise of China. The United States is aware that its power is waning. That's why it's reacting in a brutal, much more imperialistic way, intervening in various parts of the world. We are seeing many spaces that try to push some South-South relations, but they are still very contradictory. And I'm talking here about the BRIC space. But I feel that there is a kind of a move towards multipolarity that could provide some opportunities for progressive movements all over the world to shape a kind of an emancipatory way out of this. That may take time. That's why we need to have a long durée perspective. But I believe that Palestine liberation cannot be separated from the liberation of the whole world, the liberation of all humanity. Palestinians, I don't feel they are just fighting for themselves. They are also fighting for humanity. They are fighting one system of oppression, which is a capitalist and an imperialist system. And solidarity needs to go beyond the national, the regional, to become this international project that need to connect with some of the lessons of the decolonization, third worldism, and the Bandung moment to bring about some of those principles that wanted to build a better world, a world that is free of injustice, of oppression, and domination. I believe it is possible. It's not going to happen overnight. And I think it's part of our responsibility to analyze things in that way, to show the interconnectedness of our struggle, to show the links that ties us together, and that our fights are similar and we need to fight together.
You've been listening to Politics Theory Other. If you've been enjoying PTO and finding it useful, then please do consider becoming a £5 supporter on Patreon. The show depends entirely on listener support, and if you sign up, you can access bonus content, including listener questions episodes with PTO guests. Go to patreon.com/poltheoryother to sign up. The show's music and graphic design is produced by Planet B Productions. Thanks as ever for listening. I'll be back soon.